and Chloe Anthony from the University of Essex. Before I'm introducing them, I will be just going through a few housekeeping matters. First of all, we're not in a webinar today, we're in a Zoom call, and this means that I kindly ask you to keep your microphones muted during the duration of the presentations, as well as at the end whilst we're going through the Q&A. We have a chat function, as most of you will already have seen. It would be great if you could introduce yourself, say where you're calling from and how your research might be related to what we're talking about today. The chat function is open right now. It will stay open until I'm done talking, but we will just disable it for the duration of the presentation so we can all focus on them without any disruptions. The chat will be opened again after the presentations. However, this is purely to allow anyone to respond to the presentations or maybe share resources that they think others might find interesting as well. The Q&A, however, we are just going to do virtually, so by raising your hand, and I will give you the floor, and that way you will be able to ask questions, and hopefully there will be ample opportunity to do that. And I've also been told, although I can't see that at the moment in my screen anymore, that you're best to click the button on the right top corner which says speakers view, so you can really make the most of this seminar. Let me see if there's anything I forgot to say. No, I think that's it. If there's any technical issues, please do let me or Francesco know, and we can hopefully help you out. And without further ado, I think I will introduce the webinar of today, which is titled Brexit, Executive Power and the Internal Market, the Case of Food Safety. Obviously, this is a very timely matter, whereas maybe for some of us who are not working on Brexit every day, it feels a little bit like it's passing us by in the midst of all the other chaos that's going on. But the topic of food safety and food standards has been something that actually has made it to the media, to the national news in recent times. And it's really exciting to be able to welcome these two experts on these topics to get a better insight into what really is happening. We're joined today by Dr. Emily Lydgate. She is a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex, a specialist in international trade law. She also PhD from King's College London, and she's also the Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. Emily has consulted at UNEP and has advised both governments and business on the topic of Brexit. And for the topic of today, although this is not mentioned on the slide, she's also a member of the newly founded Future British Standards Coalition. Welcome to you, Emily. And our other speaker of today is Chloe Anthony, also from the University of Sussex, where she is doing a PhD. Her research focuses primarily on collaborative land management, but Chloe also provides research assistance to the UK Trade Policy Observatory, among others, on the topic of standards. So a very warm welcome to you both, and yes, let's start the presentations. Chloe,
hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Yes, fantastic.
And can see my screen properly? Oh, it's not moving. Hold on, I'll just have to try that again. So hopefully it will work this time. And it's moving now. Yes, good. Okay, so thank you for inviting Emily and I to speak today about our research on food safety and Brexit. We're very pleased to be able to share our research with you and look forward to your questions and comments. We've been developing this research with the UK Trade Policy Observatory and have written 3 briefing papers on the subject, and I'll pop those in the chat afterwards. So today we're going to talk about the impact of Brexit on food law. We're going to look at the location and scope of powers to make food regulations post-Brexit in relation to 3 new governance mechanisms. So these are retained EU law, the developing UK-wide common frameworks, and the internal market bill. And we're also going to outline the broader significance of these developments constitutionally and for trade. So the main arguments that we're presenting today are that despite assurances by the UK government, food regulation post-Brexit will be very different. We're seeing 2 central themes: a consolidation of power with UK ministers and significant drivers for regulatory divergence between the 4 nations of the UK. These developments raise concerns about how regulation is made and the opportunity for scrutiny, as well as concerns about consumer and environmental protection. These new frameworks make clear that leaving the EU will provide a major shake-up to UK food regulation, and this has implications for both how food regulation works and where it takes place. This is even without consideration of the Northern Ireland Protocol, which we won't deal with today. So turning first to retained EU law. Under the EU Withdrawal Act 2018, EU law is largely incorporated into UK law by means of secondary legislation, that is by statutory instruments. Under the Act, extensive powers were given to UK ministers to make amendments to EU laws. This is to correct deficiencies, in other words, to make technical amendments. Assurance was given that no major policy changes and no new legal frameworks would be introduced by means of these delegated powers. It is difficult, however, if not impossible, to maintain that no new legal frameworks are created in the process of the UK leaving the EU. The Supreme Court, amongst others, readily recognise the constitutional significance of Brexit. And given the interaction between legal and policy frameworks, the idea that no major policy change occurs is also easily contested. As we'll see, even if no major policy change is made in the SIs and new primary legislation provide for extensive delegated powers for UK ministers going forwards. So delegated legislation has been the main lawmaking technique in the UK. This is in the context of EU membership and also the modern regulatory state. And the use of this technique has increased significantly in relation to EU exit. The government argues that this is the only possible means in the circumstances to create a functioning statute book post-Brexit. However, it's well recognised that secondary legislation processes in the UK are flawed. Numerous select committees, NGOs, think tanks. Hello? Sorry? Somebody, I think, just heard something. Something might not be muted. So numerous think tanks, NGOs, the Hansard Society, academics have drawn attention to inadequacy of this process, particularly in relation to the lack of opportunity for parliamentary and public scrutiny. So how does this play out in relation to UK food standards and safety? Food law is extensive. It has developed over decades in the EU and is intimately related to trade law and policy. It includes framework legislation, setting out the general principles and governance processes, as well as extensive regulation on different types of food and feed products, their production and distribution. So our analysis of secondary legislation that retains EU law for specific areas of food law found that these EU exit SIs require detailed analysis to check how EU rules and processes are converted. Our research began with a project for Pesticide Action Network, looking at secondary legislation that will convert EU law on the approval of pesticides and maximum residue levels of pesticides in food into UK law. Then we broadened this analysis to other aspects of food safety, including GMO authorizations and labeling, food additive authorizations and monitoring, and microbiological food safety. So taking pesticides as an example, and this broadly reflects changes in other areas, we find that on the face of the legislation, there is a consolidation of power to UK ministers. We find, somewhat understandably, that EU institutions and processes are omitted, but they are not replaced with details on new governance frameworks. Rather, they're replaced with discretionary power for UK ministers to amend, revoke, and make pesticide law. This shows how the EU exit SIs are consolidating power in the executive of the devolved nations in the UK government. Notably, the most recent SIs have deleted reference to Northern Ireland in order to comply with the Northern Ireland Protocol. So turning to the general framework for food law in the EU and UK, adopted in 2002 in response to several food safety crises, including BSE, the EU refocused its food policy to that of food safety. So the GFL sets out the aims and scope of EU food law, the general principles of risk analysis, risk assessment, and precaution, obligations for food businesses and public authorities, and it established the European Food Safety Authority and the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed. It also sets out how delegated powers may be exercised. Now, although the EU exit SIs retain the aims and scope of EU food law, the general principles of risk analysis and precaution and obligations for food businesses, we can see already that there are important omissions. The GFL chapters on EFSA and the Rapid Alert System, including how scientific opinions are considered and communicated, is omitted in the EU exit SIs. And the designation or role of the food standards agencies is not set out in the SIs themselves, only in the explanatory memorandum. Now, the role of the UK food standard authorities is found in UK primary legislation. They undertake similar but not equivalent roles to EFSA, and it could be argued that their new functions should be set out in amending the general food law. Also, the GFL provision for the exercise of delegation is replaced by powers for UK ministers for England, Welsh ministers for Wales, and Scottish ministers for Scotland to make secondary legislation, amending EU measures at their discretion. Again, the latest draft SIs remove references to Northern Ireland authorities and replace UK with Great Britain in order to achieve compliance with the Northern Ireland Protocol. So the exercise of delegation in the EU in general and for specific areas of food law is set out in detail in EU law. This is not the case with the EU exit SIs. And as we've noticed, the exercise of delegation in the UK lacks scrutiny and opportunity for amendment through parliamentary or public processes. So in summary, for retained EU law, we're seeing the EU law is retained within the UK, but it's not equivalent. There is extensive discretionary powers for GB ministers, and this creates potential for divergence in the future. These developments raise significant governance issues, and these are important for society and the environment. So governance issues include the lack of opportunity for Parliament and civil society to scrutinise future amendments, as well as inadequate mechanisms for the four executives to work together. And trade issues relate to the mechanisms for the four nations to act as a unified UK, challenging both the maintenance of open borders within the UK and the ability of the UK to enter into international trade and treaty agreements. So the need for a unified approach to food law and many other devolved areas in order to replicate the functions of EU arrangements has been recognised by the UK government and the devolved administrations. They have agreed to develop UK-wide common frameworks through a collaborative process. The Joint Ministerial Committee is the main mechanism for intergovernmental cooperation in the UK. There have long been calls to improve the informal and ad hoc arrangements that characterise this key element of the UK's constitutional settlement. These concerns have been amplified by Brexit. A JMC subcommittee for European negotiations was formed in response to Brexit, and in October 2017 set out principles for cooperation between the UK government and the devolved nations. These are to establish common frameworks, respect the devolution settlements, and to ensure recognition of the connection between Northern Ireland and Ireland and adhere to the Belfast Agreement. The latest government analysis identified 154 policy areas of retained EU law where there may be a need to establish UK-wide common frameworks. These policy areas have been categorised. There are 115 policy areas where it's agreed that no further action is required. There are 22 policy areas in category 2 that can include EU retained law, but these rules or processes are not regarded as constituting a legal framework. And there are 18 policy areas which it is said to be requiring legislative frameworks, although it includes non-legislative framework agreements and a consistent approach to retained EU law. These policy areas include agriculture, fisheries, animal health and welfare, plant health, chemicals and pesticides, as well as food composition and standards, and food and feed safety and hygiene. Here we can see the rationale for the categorisation is largely trade-based, and the frameworks are distinguished by their legal nature. However, the distinction between legislative and non-legislative frameworks is unclear. Some commentators have suggested common frameworks are essentially ways of working together, noting that they're limited to specific areas of retained EU law. Now, whether they should function as a means of intergovernmental collaboration and not have legislative status or outcomes is a matter for debate, and this debate is of constitutional significance. One of these common frameworks is for food and feed safety and hygiene. Now, this common framework is currently in its consultation phase. The most recent public statement on this framework suggests the aim is for food and feed law and policy to be as unified as possible while allowing for evidence-based divergence. and that policy development is to be delivered through collaboration and a shared risk analysis process. Now, reports suggest that much positive effort has been devoted to agreeing this common framework. However, the publication of the Internal Market Bill has given rise to confusion as to the legal status of the FFSH Common Framework. The most recent statement acknowledged that the relationship is unresolved and distinguishes between a legislative internal market approach and the common framework, suggesting that these operate at different levels to provide complete coverage. This is despite placing the FFSH in category 3, which suggests that it requires a legislative status and a consistent approach to retained EU law. So I'll now hand over to Emily to talk about the internal market developments, UK internal market developments and implications for food regulation.
Hello, everyone. So Chloe outlined this common framework, sort of broad consultative process in play, which basically provide a way of replicating, replacing the free movement principles that we had under EU law with something else. Because the last thing we want is to have, all different types of food regulations in all different developed nations, because then there's this question of how do food producers deal with that? Do they have to create different products to meet different standards? Do we have to have border checks in Gretna Green or along the River Dee to ensure that that all these food products are meeting each other's standards? So how do you deal with this? So common frameworks are one approach, but the central UK government has always been nervous about this. They've been nervous about common frameworks being enough or sufficient to guarantee this free movement post-Brexit. And the really dramatic sort of bolt out of the blue manifestation of this nervousness is the Internal Market Bill, which in a sense has the same exact aim of the common frameworks to replace free movement principles with something else, but it does this completely differently. So I'm just going to briefly outline some of the elements of the bill most relevant for food standards, which are market access principles. And then I'll talk about how these differ from and also undermine common frameworks. Okay, so under the Internal Market Bill, the main way that divergence between England, Scotland, and Wales will be managed is through mutual recognition. So some of you may be familiar with this if you're EU lawyers or WTO lawyers even. But basically what that does is it ensures that goods that are made in or imported into one part of the UK where they can lawfully be sold can also be lawfully sold in other parts of the UK. So this also means that regulations that apply to these goods in that other part of the UK will be disapplied. And this mutual recognition is very, very broad. So it covers physical characteristics of products, but also how they're made, certified, and labeled. So there's a really narrow set of exceptions. And again, if you're a student of EU law, you could contrast this with EU law. So basically, the only time that you are allowed to say, I'm not going to mutually recognize that, that product is if it poses a serious risk to public health. So things like diseases or contamination, for the most part. There's also an exception for pesticides and chemicals and fertilizers, but for reasons that we don't really have time to go into, those don't amount to very much. And then there's also another market access principle, which is non-discrimination, which kind of picks up the rest. So it deals with what's described sometimes as selling arrangements. So things like display, terms of sale, what time you're allowed to, if you have a restrictions on when you're supposed to sell something or how it's displayed in your shop, and that just says that you can't discriminate against one devolved nation's products. So, and that's less, I think, relevant for our purposes today. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple of examples. about how the mutual recognition principle might apply in practice. So the three nations have more or less the same EU-derived legislation as a starting point here. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at hypothetical future scenarios. So these are hypothetical scenarios in which one of the devolved nations decides to introduce a new regulation, but this new regulation threatens to impede the free movement of goods within the UK. So remember that the mutual recognition principle applies to production processes. So this hypothetical example is, imagine that Scotland decided that it wanted to introduce a ban on farrowing crates for pigs. But England decided that it was going to continue to allow them. So Scotland would be welcome to do that, but it would still need to allow pork products reared in farrowing crates to be exported into Scotland. And of course, this is an example I chose because it recalls what happened when sow stalls were banned in England but still allowed in the EU. This is an example that's often given because the EU didn't enforce its sow stall ban and the UK did, and therefore a lot of UK pig farmers went out of business because it just became more expensive for them to comply with the regulation that their competitors didn't. So they were competitively undercut by imports. So that's one example. Here's another example. So again, this has to do with production process. So this is about maximum residue levels for pesticides. So this is a hypothetical example in which the UK decides to raise its maximum residue level to 8 milligrams per kilogram. That's the same as the US maximum residue level for malathion. Scotland says we're going to stay with the EU level, which is 200 or 400 times less, 0.02 milligrams per kilogram. So Scotland would be welcome to do that domestically, but would have to import these apples. A final example, labeling. So, and I think it's important to note that this applies, because you would think, well, let's say England decides to start producing ractopamine treated pork. This is banned currently. And Scotland says, well, we're not going to ban it, but we'd like it to be labeled. But England says, we don't really think it needs a label. We don't want to do that. So again, Scotland would be welcome to require domestic producers to label, but it wouldn't be able to impose a labeling requirement on England, on these imports coming from England. And of course, this mutual recognition principle also applies to goods imported into England. So it follows that if, for example, this pork was imported from the US, it would have to be able to move freely within the UK. So what are some of the concerns we have? I mean, I think in my sort of hypothetical examples, I'm really portraying Scotland as the country which has its standards sort of undermined. And even if these do not pertain in practice, I think it serves a larger point, which is that there's quite a bit of asymmetry, which I think takes the form of whatever country produces the most of a particular product becomes the de facto standard bearer. So Scotland can claim, market dominance when it comes to, whiskey, salmon, Arbroath Smokies, Iron Brew, but England is by far the biggest economy, and that means in practice, it's going to shape regulation. And that's because, complying with higher regulation is more expensive. So, and I gave the example of the sow stall ban in the UK. If you have these goods coming in that are produced more cheaply with lower regulatory requirements, that's going to disincentivize, complying with stricter regulations or setting stricter regulations. And another concern is that producers can just move around. You could just move over the border to where the regulations suit you better. And of course, there's very, very narrow exemptions to this. So you couldn't say, well, we believe that there's an important public health objective here, important environmental objective in banning ractopamine treated pork or antibiotics or what have you. And therefore we don't want to mutually recognize this product. So basically what we've thrown at you is this really complex landscape, right? So we have three different regimes with really different implications. So first, Chloe talked about retained EU legislation. And if we think about how that would apply, I'm almost done, by the way. If you think about how that would apply to pesticides, it would basically allow England, Scotland, and Wales to all have their own maximum residue levels for pesticides, which retains devolution, but creates this internal trade problem. Then you have these common frameworks, which are basically it's not really clear what how they bind on countries, but the FFSH just says this is our common approach to risk assessment. Then we're going to have a common framework on pesticides, which haven't been produced yet, so we don't know what that's going to say. And then we have the Internal Market Bill, which says, sure, you can all do your own thing, but you have to admit each other's products without any additional restrictions. But I think it's really important to note that when we kind of put these pieces of the puzzle together, what happens is that the Internal Market Bill dominates over all of these and in fact undermines common frameworks. Why is that? Well, for the one thing, if we contrast common frameworks in the Internal Market Bill, the common frameworks allow for the possibility of divergence. So in the sense that, Scotland could require England to meet its regulatory requirements. And this is, totally within the realm of possibilities of an internal market. And indeed, for example, now Scotland bans raw milk. This is allowed in other devolved nations. So that means if, God forbid, Scotland decided to import milk from England, English producers would have to comply with that. They couldn't export raw milk to England. And this is, again, a valid form for managing an internal market is to allow this type of divergence. The US is another example of a country that allows for a lot of that type of divergence of requiring other states to meet your regulation. The Internal Market Bill doesn't allow for that possibility at all. So it closes off that space and requires absolutely seamless market access. Another really important difference is that common frameworks are collaborative, whereas the Internal Market Bill is really top down. So it was created without consultation from the devolved nations, and it's a protected enactment, which means that devolved nations cannot modify it. And so that is, obviously created a lot of backlash, a huge amount of backlash from devolved nations who do not support this bill. They will not vote for it. So there's also been a lot of questioning of why we even need this internal market bill. So, for example, Food Standards Scotland has questioned the application of why we need this when we have common frameworks. The Lords Committee on the Constitution said, quote, "The government has failed to explain why a combination of retained EU law, its existing powers to amend that law, and common frameworks could not provide the certainty required at the end of the transition period to secure an effective UK internal market. Such an approach would obviate the need for a bill." So there's been a huge amount of backlash about how this affects the devolution settlement and whether it's even necessary. And of course, it also sits really uncomfortably atop these drivers for increased divergence. And I think a really notable one of these is that Scotland has stated its desire to maintain alignment with EU regulation, whereas England has gone into the Brexit process with this drive to take back control of our regulation. So we can see that there's all kinds of possibilities for England to change its regulation and Scotland to want to maintain it, giving rise to more needs for this type of mutual recognition. And of course, trade agreements are a really important driver of that as well. So just to conclude, as you have probably gathered, there's quite a complex landscape for post-Brexit food standards and legislation. The Internal Market Bill is set to be the predominant force shaping regulatory processes. And putting all these things together, there are real changes to how and where food standards regulation takes place. How is it taking place? UK ministers are setting it. It's much less consultative and there are fewer checks and balances. Where is it taking place? Well, the most influential regulation is in wherever the biggest market is because of the Internal Market Bill. So centralization of power is a big theme, centralization of power in the central UK government. But I think there are a lot of unresolved questions, and indeed we've done a lot of really policy-oriented work here. So I think what we're looking to do is turn this into an academic article. So we're really looking forward to sort of getting your feedback, particularly conscious that you're in Scotland, which is obviously a country that's really affected by this. We're not devolution experts, so we're really interested in any of your perspectives and thoughts about how we could develop this work further.
Thank you so much. That was really great. I think, well, two observations from my end. I think the examples that you use, even for people who are not working on a day-to-day basis in this area, they really make it live and see how this can really affect, yeah, even what we're doing indeed here in Scotland. And for me, I am working on a lot of these topics from an EU perspective, and it's quite. I haven't kept that well track of all the Brexit developments, and seeing how the whole system is going to be dismantled is quite something. So thank you so much for that. I will not really say anything more, because I would like other people to have the opportunity to ask their questions. Like I said before, it would be preferable if people can use their cameras, turn on your camera, raise your hand. If that is, however, an issue for whatever reason, then obviously you're more than welcome to put your question into the chat. So are there any questions for and sorry, I should have said thank you so much for that. That's really great. Thank you for those presentations. So are there any questions from any of the participants that we have here today? It must have been quite clear, or a bit mind-boggling. Either one. I see. Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chloe, for putting these briefing papers in. I told Emily that I read one of them this morning, and yeah, it really sets out very well what you have discussed here today.
Well, maybe I could ask a question just to try to get the discussion going. Because I think what we're we feel like this could be developed in a lot of different directions. So we could look into the sort of the trade negotiation side of it. We could look into the idea of sort of the constitutional significance of this, and, you know, is the Internal Market Bill a constitutional act, and what does it mean for devolution? And or we could just really get into the nitty gritty of the food standards. So, I mean, I guess our question is sort of how do we sort of turn this into an academic article? Is it sufficient to just explain what's going on? Because it seems like it's so complicated just to set out how all these things work, and I don't think that many people even understand that at this stage. So is that sufficient, or how could we develop this?
I will give a first reaction. I mean, it depends. I completely agree, and I understand where you're getting from. And what I was thinking when I was listening, that obviously, if you have an interest in food standards, there's so much here. But even if you're not, if that's not your area of expertise, you're right. There are some more fundamental questions maybe that can definitely come from this, that might speak to a broader audience. But you are right, to some degree, this is such a complex matter, even trying to really understand it. And for me personally, I think being able to give some of these examples, but that obviously does focus it really on the food standards matters, but does make it live. It does make it more tangible for people on what's going on. But maybe there's other people here in the audience that have who are maybe working on other topics, have a sense where this article could go. Ludovine, please.
Thanks, Miranda. Lovely to see you. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. So I'm Ludivine Potetin, I'm based at Cardiff University. So I'm working on a very similar topic, but in relation to agriculture more than food safety, and what that would mean for the CAP in terms of the recentralization of power, you know, the internal market bill, the common frameworks. And I think that, as you said, it's so complicated, this topic, that even just trying to explain it is incredibly difficult. And you made a really good job of that. So well done. one of my comments would be, so as you want to take it, I mean, it really depends on what kind of paper you want to have and how you want to kind of take it. But one of the things I wanted to say was in relation to the arguments you made and the relationship between common frameworks and the internal market bill. And for me, it's slightly different from what you said. For me, the common frameworks sit on top and provide the umbrella within which sits the internal market bill, which means that the common frameworks are one of the ways, I think, forward for the four governments to actually come together and increase, to come together to agree to legislative frameworks, mostly in relation to SPS matters, but I think most importantly to raise the bar. Because what is happening with the internal market bill is that we could have a tendency to go lower and lower or not increase and lead to lower or decreased innovation on the part of the whole of the UK, but in particular the devolved, and in particular Wales, who is very pro environment. So I think that, for me, one of the ways forward is to actually put the emphasis more on common frameworks to raise the bar, rather than, to kind of escape the internal market bill, so that we actually have a better environmental standards, food standards, animal welfare standards. And I think that's it for my comment. I know it's a very long comment, but I just took the opportunity. Thank you. But I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
To just offer a quick response to that, that they are being consulted on at the moment, the common frameworks, that the House of Lords are very keen on them, and also pointing out that why do we need an internal market bill when we can move forward with common frameworks. So we're often, we're being asked, not just Emily and I, all of us are being asked, how can we design common frameworks? How can we design this process? Should it be legislative? Should it be non-legislative? Which is a difficult question to answer, but also probably requires, a public debate, because this is about the constitutional settlement that we have, I think, in the devolution settlement in this country. So difficult question, and we're not experts on multi-level governance or devolution, although perhaps we all need to become experts in this field.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a little bit of a sort of, I mean, I guess I would say that we didn't necessarily communicate clearly about our perspective, which is very much that that common frameworks are the way forward. So I think the concern is that a lot of parties have recognized that, and the House of Lords put forth a beautiful amendment on this, which basically said that the internal market bill would be disapplied to any matter being dealt with under common frameworks, which would have, and this was being debated this week. So I was watching it thinking, okay, if the government accepts this, I'm going to have to rewrite this entire talk. So that will be great for the future of the UK, but terrible for me personally. So, and then of course the government rejected this. So they said because it was going to give legal uncertainty was their main reason. So I think that's why we were sort of emphasizing the internal market bill as this sort of predominant force, not because we think it should be, but because the concern is that the UK government is just sort of a bull in the china shop of the common frameworks and trampling all over them.
Yes, thank you for that. Sorry, yeah, Ludovine, by all means.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Sorry, Miranda. But just to go back to what Chloe said about common frameworks and how to do with common frameworks. We have common frameworks at the moment it's EU law. So, you know, we have a great example. Okay, it's not perfect, but you know, it would be a, you know, a good starting point to kind of work from. And so I think, and you know, as you well mentioned, you mentioned the exception, you know, the exceptions. There are exceptions under EU law in order for member states to diverge, and obviously on solid grounds. Okay, I'm not going to expand on those here, but you know, it could have been done in a different way. And you know, I've been working with Welsh government for quite a while now, and you know, they really had much hope in terms of common frameworks, but also in the internal market bill. You know, I attended some of the meetings from years back with you know, representatives from central government in terms of how can we get that going and make sure that the 4 nations are represented. And you know, we end up with something which is interesting. Is
Yes.
my comment.
It's
but yeah,
very polite word.
so
Yeah.
could have been so much more positive
Yeah.
to reflect, you know, the you know, the different kind of landscapes we have in terms of both of the environment, food, but also regulatory. And you know, this clearly re-centralize all the powers to central government. And you know, it's yeah, big constitutional issues here. But and for that, I forgot to say, I really enjoyed reading your papers as well. Sorry, forgot to say.
We've been following your work as well, so it's great. I don't think we've met, so it's good to see you. We recognize your contributions in this area, which we've been following as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Lupin. I have to say that I agree. When I see some of this coming from it as an EU perspective, you're almost thinking, why is the wheel completely being reinvented here? Indeed, we obviously have had some of these clashes also with decentralization, and then not, for example, on the topic of GMO, some of these clashes have already happened at the EU level, and can some inspiration being taken from that? But yeah, it's obviously what we have on the table right now is far from ideal. Are there any further questions? Michael, please take the floor.
Hello there. Sorry, I've just had a power cut in York, so I've just disappeared temporarily there. Just 2 things. First, I wanted to echo what Ludovine said about the talk. I think there's huge merit in just disseminating that information. There's an awful lot of it was new to me, and I think we have it's probably easy to say this when you're later in your career, but there's a sort of worry nowadays about writing things that are descriptive. I think they've got a huge positive role to play. So I think just the, as I say, the dissemination of information has a huge advantage. The other thing I was really interested in, I know that the speakers have got particular expertise in this area, is just the impact on international trade agreements. I'd be really interested to hear what people had to think about that, particularly if we've got because my understanding is that the negotiations will be largely taking place at UK level, and just how that would play out with the devolved administrations. Just any, I don't got any thoughts on that. So if you're trying to heighten your standards, say in Scotland, and the UK government is negotiating the international trade agreement, and you've got diverse standards in the UK, that strikes me as potentially problematic.
Yes, well, this is one of the tough cuts we made to the talk to try to keep the time down. But yeah, so there,
appreciated.
And I'm interested in Ludovine's perspective from the Welsh government as well. But I think this is another piece of the puzzle, really, which is that you know, there's not very much transparency in our understanding of how devolved nations are sort of feeding into or influencing trade negotiations. So they're supposed to come out with a concordat on international trade. That hasn't appeared. So there's sort of a gentleman's agreement, which is how much of the UK government seems to be run anyways. But you know, how will that function if push comes to shove? you know, my view is that sort of Scotland is to the rest of the UK as France is to the EU. I mean, they're going to, you know, be the conservative voice in all trade negotiations, and they're going to want to limit the extent to which the UK moves away from EU regulation. So how does the central UK government deal with that? Well, you know, what I think they should do is what the EU does, which is blame things on France. Say, well, we can't do that because France says we can't. So what a great political opportunity for the UK to back down on chlorinated chicken or what have you. But I don't necessarily. So I think that, you know, there's other possibilities as well besides that one, which are probably more likely. And one of them would be that Scotland simply refuses to ratify changes to, say, food standards that are agreed through an FTA. But those things are all imported into Scotland anyway under the Internal Market Bill. Another one would be that Scotland would, you know, and Wales, you know, that there would be some sort of internal agreement that would have to take place when changes were made to standards that affect areas of devolved competence, but there's not a formal requirement for that. So, you know, in other words, there's nothing legal that says that the devolved nations have to consent. It's obviously a reserved power. So the answer really, the short answer is I don't know.
Yeah. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you for that. Are there any further questions? Stephanie, would you like to? Yes.
It's not really a question. It's more a sort of comment, and a sort of where to go next, and my sort of personal preference. So you'll probably be aware that the Finance and Constitution Committee of the Scottish Parliament have been looking at the internal market and produced a paper. Well, their advisor produced a paper in August. And what I found quite interesting about that was the examination of the concept of the internal market, and, you know, the quite obvious statement that the internal market's a contested concept. And it seems to me from the sort of UK government, and I'm coming at this from a very Scottish and Northern Irish perspective, that they assume that the internal market isn't contested, that it, you know, that it's not this malleable concept. And I just wondered to what extent your future research will be looking potentially at, well, what do we mean by the internal market? How does it feed into existing constitutional processes? You know, what kind of internal market do we want, you know, as a normative concept? And and that would be my preference for your future research. And I just really wondered to what extent you'd been sort of thinking in that direction.
If you have any good literature to send, please do. I mean, I think that's a really good way of grounding this in terms of thinking about internal markets and yeah. I definitely, if you have any other things you think we should read, please send them. That's all I have to say.
I will. Thanks.
We also, going back to Ludovine's point about the EU has already been through this. Yeah, we've also been thinking about that, you know, comparing this UK, you know, proposed governance frameworks with existing EU, but that is a very tricky thing to do, you know, in terms, you know, methodologically, in terms of comparative legal analysis, but yeah, and anyways, but yeah, we've been thinking about that as a possible way to go.
Yeah, no, because obviously, you know, the examples that are always pulled on in the white paper, for instance, are, you know, Switzerland, etc. But I do, you know, I always think, well, is this comparing like with like, you know, is the canton construction in Switzerland equivalent to, you know, the devolved nations in the UK? But yeah, sorry, it was just thinking out loud there in terms of potential direction. But thank you. It was really interesting. I'm much food for thought there.
The other thing that I when I was constructing those examples, I realized that I don't really have a good sense of what the agricultural trade flows are between Scotland and England in particular. So aside from the obvious ones, so I think that's something we'd like to do, is to make our examples a little bit more grounded in reality.
I was just going to say on the coming from actually a family of farmed up in the north of England, you've got a classic example was beef production on either side of you've got the Scottish side of the borders, and up in Northumberland you've got virtually identical forms of beef agriculture, and already, for example, the concerns about different subsidy regimes have been causing a lot of concern. So I think there's going to be things where they're very different and that will cause problems, and things where it's very similar and that could likewise cause difficulties. But I did just want to echo, I thought it was a really great talk, and I think it really should be published as soon as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks for that example. That's very helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I do agree with Michael indeed that that indeed having something that is this clear, because it is very clear and written down, and maybe pull in indeed if anyone else has examples. I will also think about this that can absolutely add to the work. But it's really great, fascinating to watch. Yes, I'm conscious of time, so I think we probably have to wrap it up. But yeah, again, thank you very much for this talk, and big applause. I agree. And obviously, if anyone wants to add something or get in touch, feel free to email me, or I find you online and email out directly. But thanks so much for this.
Thank you all for coming out, and after deep into a particularly brutal term, we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. I'm looking at Francesco to probably, although his screen is currently frozen. I think he's.
Yeah, he texted me to say that he was having internet difficulties, so he may well not actually be here.
Okay.
But I believe that the Skeld people and Emily and Chloe are going to retire for 15 minutes and come back.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. For the Skeld people, we will be on a different call though, so there should be a different link, but we will resume again at 11:15, and I'm not entirely sure how I can actually cancel or stop this call, but maybe Stephanie does.
I'm not host. Do you want to make me host and I can end it?
I don't think I am either. I think only Francesco is.
I think you are now, Miranda.
Oh, am I? Okay.
I just saw a message pop up that you were.
Oh no, yeah, okay, yes, exactly. It says ends now. Okay, I will end the call. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.